Today we're going to talk about terrestrial biomes. Now, biome is a rather large organizational structure of our planet, like as large as you can get. Let's just talk about the different hierarchies of scale. So you can start with an individual organism, you, me, a cat, a plant, an individual. Now, when we talk about a population, what we're saying is all of the individuals of that particular species in a given area combined. So the population of people in Seoul, the population of cats in my neighborhood, the population of fern plants in the park near my house. A community is the next scale up from that. The community is all of the organisms that share a given area. So we could talk about what is the community of organisms present in the park near my house. It would include birds, worms, fern plants, trees, flowers, butterflies, all the different populations that are sharing an environment. We call that a community. An ecosystem is the community of organisms, all the different populations of organisms that share an area, plus all the what we call abiotic factors, the non-living components like the air, the water, the nutrients. That's what we call an ecosystem. And then a biome is just a group of related ecosystems that have certain similarities to them that we find across the planet. So they're not necessarily all one big ecosystem, but they're ecosystems that have commonalities to them. And it's just helpful as human beings as we start thinking about our planet to talk in terms of these broader categories, biomes. Okay, well, here's just a graphic I like. So you see I have an individual elk, I have a population of multiple elks, I have a community that includes the elk as well as moose and birds and beavers and trees. And then the ecosystem includes the air and the water and the nutrients. And then a biome is just a region of the planet that show it here in blue where all these organisms are living. So let's just talk about biotic and abiotic factors. So abiotic factors means aspects of an ecosystem that are not living, that have an impact on the ecosystems. That could be chemicals in the air and in the water. It could be the water itself. It could be how much sunlight comes in, how hot it is, how much it rains. Those are non-living things that influence what is going to live there. So we call those abiotic factors. Biotic factors are the living things in the ecosystem. And basically, a lot of them have an impact on the system itself. So you talk about what plants live in a given area have a lot to do with what animals live in the area. The dead organisms in an area contribute nutrients, so that would be considered a biotic factor, as would animal waste. So any part of the environment that is alive we call a biotic factor. And often what we find with discussion of biomes is the biotic factors are what we notice about a particular biome. It's how we identify a biome in many cases. So when we divide the world up into different biomes, basically it usually comes down to a shared climate. And because that shared climate, you have certain plant species that are evident. That's what our eyes notice when we see a biome. And those plant species in turn inform what animal species are going to be present. So the things that generally drive a biome to be what it is are the average temperature. Does it get above freezing or not? Does it stay constant or not? How much precipitation? That's a really big one. What type of soil? Is it high in nutrients, low in nutrients? Is it acidic? And then what are the biotic factors, the dominant plants and animals? That's what makes up biomes. Now, we're often going to want to talk about what we call limiting factors. So what particular aspect of a biome is placing limits on the amount of NPP that we can get? Why aren't we getting more productivity out of the system? What's stopping it from being at its maximum? And so generally we find that it comes down to precipitation. If the weather gets below freezing or it just doesn't get very warm, that places a limit on it. A lack of nutrients can place a limit on it. Poor soils can place limits on it. So things that limiting factors are those things that keep plants from growing and therefore keep food webs from becoming larger and having more biomass in them. So here's a map of the biomes of the world. Now, there's lots of different ways you can define biomes. This is a fairly small list here. You can get much more detail, but I like to keep it kind of broad. So basically, we'll go through each of these in turn. In the very northern areas and in high mountain regions in the Andes and in the Himalaya, we have tundra. Then we have taiga, which is also called boreal forest, which is found generally in a band across the north just below the tundra. And then below the tundra, we get two things. We get what is called seasonal deciduous forests or temperate deciduous forests. Basically, that's where Korea is. The trees lose their leaves in the wintertime. And then we also get grasslands. So you notice that there's big swaths of grasslands in Asia and North America, in South America, in Australia. All right. We also have what we call savanna, or another word for it would be tropical grasslands, and this is actually a rather large biome. So you find it in Africa. So when we think of the Lion King, whatever we think of this savanna, you also get it in South America. You get it to some extent in northern Mexico. Much of South Asia is actually that way, as well as the Mediterranean area. And then we have deserts. There's a big swath of desert here and here, as well as in the central Australia and in parts of the North American West and Mexico, and a strip here just to the west of the Andes Mountains. And finally, we have rainforests, so tropical rainforests. Tropical rainforests are found in Central America, obviously the Amazon area, the Congo area, and the Indonesian, Micronesian area. All right, so those are different biomes, and we just want to learn a little bit about each one. I'm sorry, this is kind of a long screencast, but it's a big topic. All right, so if we were to make a graph of temperature versus precipitation, I don't know why the person who did this one made cold temperatures over here, whatever, okay. So what we find is this. When it's very cold, we have tundra. As we get warmer, we're going to get boreal forest and grassland and temperate forest, or what we call temperate deciduous forest. Now, we also, as we get more and more precipitation, we move up. But let's look at low precipitation first. Tundra and desert, very low precipitation. With a little bit more precipitation, we're going to get grasslands and savanna. We're not going to worry about talking about the scrubland. With a little bit more precipitation, we're going to get temperate forests. We're not going to talk about tropical seasonal forests. With a little bit more temperature and more rain, we're going to get tropical rainforest. So those are the ones we're going to focus on. As I said, different information sources will list different biomes, and I just thought we'd limit our discussion to just those basic ones. So one of the main limiting factors in a biome is going to be precipitation, annual precipitation. So what we find is if this is how many, this is just measured in inches. So if we look at how many inches per rain per year, we're going to see deserts have very small amounts. So we're talking about like 25 centimeters or less of rain a year. Same thing is true of the tundra, which is the frozen north areas and high mountain areas. Then we have a little bit more rain, say up to 60 to 80 centimeters, and we have either grasslands or taiga, which is it's just kind of a forest found in the north. With a little bit more rain, and we get our temperate deciduous forests, and even more, we get our tropical forests. So you can see how annual rainfall has a lot to do with what a particular biome is going to look like. So let's just go through them in turn. So the tundra is found in the far north. So tundra is basically an area where you would see very few trees, or like no trees, right? You mostly see lichens, which grow on rocks. You see moss and grass, and that's about all, and some animals, but that's basically, it's very barren looking. If we look at this is called a climatograph, and I expect you to be able to analyze these. So a climatograph does two things. It shows precipitation and it shows temperature, because those are the two main limiting factors in productivity. So if you look at a climatograph, well, basically, the first thing you're going to notice this. You'll see a line of connected dots that goes across this way. That will be precipitation. Now, they're often color-coded. We often list precipitation on the left and temperature on the right. But the line that you see will be for the temperature. And then precipitation will show up as a bar chart usually. All right, and this is basically the x-axis is months. Sometimes we'll say January, February, March, April. Sometimes we'll say month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4. But basically, we're laying out the year in terms of both what is the average amount of precipitation and temperature for a given month. So if we look at this one here, what we notice is here's our temperature. This one reversed it. So we put temperature over here, and we see here's 0 degrees. Here's freezing. And if you notice, there's just a few months, like maybe 3 months when it gets above freezing. Most of the rest of the year, it is far below freezing. That right there is very much indicative of tundra. The other thing we'd find is if we add up all the precipitation, it's not giving me a unit, but this precipitation is in millimeters, we're going to see there's just not that much precipitation happening here. So here's what it looks like. You see, there's no trees. That's because it's so cold. One of the main limiting factors here is actually the presence of what we call permafrost. The soil stays frozen, and because it is frozen, there's no way for trees to grow roots down, so you just never see any trees. We don't get much precipitation. What we do is mostly snow. We got a little bit of rain in the warmer months, but the other thing too is light is a limiting factor, and the light is always low in the sky in these, well, at least in the Arctic tundras, and so there's not much light, there's not much temperature, and there's permafrost. So the main limiting factors here are going to be low temperatures and the presence of permafrost. The biotic factors that we find in the tundra, we tend to find, first of all, very low productivity. There's not much productivity there. Some of the lowest on the planet. The only thing that's lower is desert. And this is because the temperatures are very cold, the light is very weak, it's very difficult for plants to grow. So if you don't have much in the way of plant growth and in PP, you don't get much in the way of biodiversity. There's not a lot of different animal species to be found. There's not a lot of different plant species to be found. It's a very short growing season. And basically the animals that live there, they are going to either have to migrate in and out as caribou do. So when the winter comes, they're just going to leave. Or maybe they'll hibernate like this guy does. And they'll just spend the winter in a state of very low metabolism sleep. And you also have a lot of burrowing organisms that try to burrow down to get out of the cold temperatures in the wintertime. Let's talk about taiga. So you pronounce it like lions and taiga, okay? So taiga, which is also called boreal forest, this is the biome that's immediately below, or I should say south of, the Arctic tundra biome. It's actually the world's largest, most expansive biome. It may not look like it on this map, but it is. And it's basically you think of it as conifer trees, pine trees, trees with needles instead of leaves. And the reason they have needles instead of leaves is because it snows, and that snow would take the leaves off. So they have these little tiny needles that can photosynthesize all year whenever there's any light at all. Now, if we look at a climate graph for that, so here we have our temperatures here, and we can see that here's 0, and the temperature is getting above freezing for about half the year. So that's generally what we find in the taigas. About half the year it's above freezing, about half the year it's below freezing, but it's still quite cold. And so temperature is a limiting factor here. There's also a little bit more precipitation than we had in the tundra, but it's still fairly low precipitation rate. Now, the abiotic factors that control the climate here are going to be those long, cold winters, moderate but not high precipitation, a lot of snow cover in the winter, so a lot of organisms still have to hibernate. But here's one that's a little bit different and unique to this one, and that is that these conifer needles, when they fall off the trees and they decompose, they tend to increase the acidity of the soil. So we have acidic soil, and acidic soil tends to leach nutrients. So we have acidic soil that's fairly low in nutrients. And that's a pretty strong limiting factor there, as are low temperatures. Now, the biotic factors we tend to find here is we have a little bit more productivity than we have in the tundra, but still not much, because a lot of the year the temperatures are so low, photosynthesis isn't occurring. And as a result, since we don't have a lot of productivity, we don't have a lot of biodiversity. And the other thing is that the vegetation consists primarily of the dominant vegetation are needle trees like pine trees, fir trees, what we call coniferous evergreen trees. You also have a lot of megafauna. You have like moose and elk and other large grazing herbivores, wolves. Now, temperate seasonal forest, which is also known as temperate deciduous forest, or basically we have trees that have large leaves, And they gather a lot of light during the growing season, but in the wintertime, they drop those leaves, so they're not getting the trees aren't losing their limbs because of it. And these typically are found at mid latitudes for the most part. Let's look at a climate graph for this temperate deciduous forest. We see that now the temperature is above freezing for more than half of the year. And in fact, this is a pretty cold version of it. In many places, it does seem to get down to freezing. What we find is that we have hot summers, we have 4 seasons. In the winter season, if it's not below freezing, it's close to it, and the leaves fall off. That's the main thing about this one. And it gets quite a bit of precipitation, not as much as the rainforest, but a fair amount. And as a result, there's pretty good productivity here. So the abiotic factors we find are the fact that we have 4 seasons. So we have a summer, winter, spring, and fall. The fall being the big one. The deciduous means the leaves fall. Okay. There is a fair amount of precipitation here, like up to 150 centimeters a year. And here's one of the main things that make this different. When all these leaves fall, they return nutrients to the soil. So the soil in this biome tends to be very nutrient rich. Now, the main limiting factor in this environment is the fact that the trees are not photosynthesizing in the winter. So you could get more energy in the system if they could photosynthesize in the winter, but they don't because the leaves fall off most of the trees here. Biotic factors here, we find is we have a very productive environment because those broad leaves capture a lot of light during the growing season, and it is warm much of the year. And so because there's a lot of productivity, there's a lot of biodiversity. But the trees do go dormant in the wintertime, and the decomposing leaves contribute to fertile soil, which again in the spring allows for more plant growth and therefore more productivity. Grasslands. So temperate grasslands are found. Now this map isn't that great because this is combining both temperate and savannas, but let's ignore this map for right now. So basically, grasslands are areas where we essentially have a lack of precipitation. The temperatures are warm, but we don't have enough precipitation. It's not so low that it's a desert, but there's not enough to support trees. Trees require a lot of water, and there's just not that much precipitation in these areas. And they actually make up a fairly large part of the world's terrestrial surface area. So now, when it comes to a grassland, the temperatures can vary. You can have fairly cold grasslands. You can have fairly hot grasslands. The main thing that makes grasslands are the fact that you have probably between, say, 30 to 90 centimeters of rain per year. So you can have a lot of variation in temperature, but you have this. The limiting factor here is the precipitation, 30 to 90 centimeters. But now here's something that's very important. If there's one thing to know about this particular biome, is that these are annual plants. They grow for 1 year, these grasses. Notice, not having trees, just grasses, lots of different grasses and maybe some shrubs. Well, when these things, they die each year, their roots and the grass part itself decomposes, and that tends to make this very, very nutrient-rich soil. So even though there's not a lot of precipitation, there's a lot of nutrients in the soil that allow these plants to grow very rapidly when the growing season starts. So that if there's something you should know about it has very, very rich nutrients in the soil, but low precipitation. Biotic factors, we tend to have a lot of large grazing herds of animals. We only have grasses and shrubs. We don't have trees because there's not enough rain. We have a lot of burrowing animals because there's a lot of exposure to predators. So a lot of mammal species tend to live underground to try to avoid predators. And the biodiversity is kind of moderate. It's not as low as it would be in, say, the tundra or desert, not as high as it would be with more rain. Basically, biodiversity tracks pretty closely with productivity. Now, a savanna, which is also called a tropical grassland, now this map is a little bit more accurate, although we should include this up here as well, this Mediterranean area. Here we have basically mostly grasslands. It's a little bit warmer. We tend to get a little bit more in the way of shrubs and small trees. But if we look at a climate graph here, what we notice is there's very little seasonal change. That's because it's tropical. So anytime we see that the temperature stays fairly flat across the year, we know we're getting close to the equator, so we're in the tropics. And if we look, one thing that's a little bit different, if the total average rainfall in a savanna is basically about the same as it is in a temperate grassland. It's about 30 to 90 centimeters. One of the differences, though, it mostly tends to happen in a short monsoon period. Most of the rain comes in a very short period, and that's why you can get in that short period. You do have enough rain coming down that you can get shrubs and trees to grow, but most of the rest of the year it's pretty low precipitation. So abiotic factors, again, it's the low precipitation, warm temperatures all year. Again, with lots of grasses, the soil is going to be very rich in nutrients because their roots decompose and add nutrients back in the soil. Again, like grasslands, the main limiting factor is the low precipitation that you get. And again, the biotic factors are pretty much the same that you would get in a temperate grassland, except you would have a little bit more in the way of shrubs and small isolated trees. Deserts are basically just areas where you have very, very, very low rainfall, say 25 centimeters or less per year, and consequently you don't get much in the way of soil development, plant growth. It doesn't necessarily imply that it's hot. A lot of times we think of deserts being hot. They don't have to be hot, but there's very little soil, and what soil there is very low in nutrients. So that really puts a real limiting factor on plant growth. So this one here, if I look at, I can tell this one is south of the equator because it's cold in July and warmer in December and January. So you should be able to look at a climate graph and make that determination. I can tell it's not really tropical because there's such a large seasonal change here. If I look here, I notice that the precipitation is very low. It barely gets above 50 millimeters. So if I add all this up, I'm going to see I come up with like maybe 10, 15, maybe 30. I'm getting around 30 centimeters a year. So this one's almost not a desert. Right? The temperature can even get below freezing. Keep that in mind. It doesn't have to be cold to be a desert. The main thing about a desert is the lack of precipitation. And because there's a lack of precipitation, we're talking about 25 centimeters or less, you tend to get very, very extreme temperature changes, day-night temperature changes, because there's little moisture in the air or the ground to moderate that. And one of the main things to keep in mind is that the soil is very, very low in nutrients, not very well developed. It's often just sand, gravel, clay, and that really makes it difficult for plants to grow. So it has the lowest productivity of any terrestrial biome by far. And because it has a very low productivity, there's also very little in the way of biodiversity. And one biotic factor that's worth noticing here is that the plants that grow there tend to be ones that are able to store large quantities of water within them. So we're talking succulent plants and cacti. And we also find that most of the animals have adapted to also either store water or avoid contact with the ground. They tend to be small animals because large animals tend to require too much water. And the last one I'll talk about is tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforest is found equatorially. And you can see we find it in South America, we find it in the Amazon area, we find it in West Africa, we find it in Southeast Asia, and in the Indonesian archipelago. Tropical rainforest, you look at it right away, you can tell two things. The temperature doesn't change much, and it always stays fairly high, say above 20, between 20 and 30 degrees. And the precipitation can stay constant all year, or it can go up and down. But you'll notice we often get precipitation levels that are, say, 300 to 500 millimeters in a given month. So most places don't get that much rain. But that's like, this is half a meter of rain a month. That's a lot of rain. So typically in a tropical rainforest, there will be months where we get half a meter of rain or close to it. The abiotic factors, the very high rates of precipitation, you can get as much as 10 meters of rain a year in some places, very little variation in temperature. And one thing that's a little bit surprising is the soil tends to be very low in nutrients. And the reason it's very low in nutrients is there's so much rain, it just leaches things out of there. Plus, what lands on the ground tends to get caught up in living organisms rather than going into the soil. And the other thing is that the sunlight is very strong at the top of the forest, but at the very bottom of the forest, very little of it can penetrate. So things in the bottom are dealing with maybe 6% of the light that you have at the surface. So there's a big vertical separation in light intensity. Biotic factors, basically, there's very, very highest productivity of any place on land. Very, very dense vegetation with a canopy of leaves over the forest floor. Extremely high biodiversity. And because of this, we get a lot of symbiosis, organisms that have two different species that have evolved in such a way that they rely on each other in order to survive. So we see a lot of that type of coevolutionary process happening in these environments. So the last slide I just want to show is a comparison of productivity of MPP in different areas. So let's just look, tropical rainforest, lots of rain, lots of, really the only limiting factor there is probably the soil, and you get just this arbitrary, this is kilocalories per square meter per year, around 9,000. All right. Now let's compare that to, say, a deciduous forest. Well, a deciduous forest has the second highest productivity, and it has 6,000. Remember that in a deciduous forest, there's lots of rain, there's nutrient-rich soil, it's warm much of the year. But now if we look at, say, grasslands, let's look at boreal forest. So boreal forest has significantly less productivity. Remember, these are like pine trees, and that's largely due to the fact that much of the year, half the year or so, it's below freezing, so we just can't get much in the way of productivity. Plus, pine needles are not that efficient at capturing sunlight. We find that savannas and temperate grasslands tend to have fairly low productivity because of the lack of rainfall. Down here, we see deserts have the lowest of all, and that's because I don't know if you can see it on yours. I can't see it on mine, but I think it's 200. That's because there's just so little rain. And then we have tundra, and tundra also has very low productivity. It has low rainfall, but also, and more importantly, it has that layer of permafrost and very, very, very short season when the temperatures get above freezing. So that's tundra. That's a lot of information. And please be ready to answer some questions about this tomorrow and do a couple activities where we look at the world's different terrestrial biomes.